So we've switched sides, as you can see, as to not leave anyone behind. Shamina Singh is the president of the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Economy, great name, and also an executive vice president at Mastercard for Sustainability. She worked at the White House, at the House of Representatives, at Nike, at Citi. Very impressive career that sort of merging all things together. And Shamina, maybe we'll kick off with the question of how Mastercard sees its impact on inclusive economy.
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Never been to Israel, so this is my maiden voyage. And I wanted to come here especially because of what I think is happening in Israel. And that is that the innovation that's hitting the rest of the world is concentrating in Israel. The difference is that a lot of the innovation is being exported. And so when we think about what's happening here in terms of social impact and innovation, the question becomes, how are we making sure that we're integrating to innovate inside Israel? And so I think that that's a really interesting question that we're talking about. But at a company like Mastercard, where it's a network company that's built in 210 countries, it's ubiquitous with the marketplace. The idea of separating social impact from business impact is impossible. And so the approach at Mastercard, and the one that I espouse and have been running for a number of years, is one that's an integrated approach that says it's not enough to do well and do good. In fact, it's the business model that's built on doing well by doing good. And so I just want to say one thing about that, because I think, especially for this audience, I think it's important to understand that there are three ways to do philanthropy. And there are three ways that companies can think about their social impact. The first is the more traditional approach. That's doing well and doing good by helping others. That's this idea of charitable contributions. We did it at Mastercard when we went public. We took 10% of Mastercard stock and created an independent foundation, completely separate from the company, run by its own board of directors. Because that independent foundation was used with 10% of Mastercard stock, it's now valued at over $20 billion.
Wow.
So
That's
we
impressive.
encourage companies, when they go public, to think about taking 10% of their stock and creating a separate foundation that rests on the success of their company. That's doing well and doing good by helping others. That's check writing, which is fantastic and works at scale. The other way of philanthropy, to think about philanthropy, is doing well and doing good. And that's where we were at Mastercard probably 3 years ago. And that idea is your business model also supports social impact. So this is what we hear about traditional ESG, climate. Are we having a good footprint on the world? Are we making sure we're doing no harm? Are we making sure we have good programs for our employees to volunteer? Are we making sure that we're looking at the resources to ensure that they're not hurting anything? So that's sort of doing well and doing good. And I think that's where a lot of companies are right now. Where we have sort of advanced, and where I think we all can evolve to, is doing well by doing good. Meaning that your business actually depends on your ability to have a positive social impact. So if you are negatively harming the world, or if your business model is built on harm, you will fail as a business. Yeah. And so that's what we realized pretty early on at Mastercard, is that our business couldn't succeed in a failing world. Yeah. And once you realize that, and realize that you have to be invested in the larger global economy, you end up with something called the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth.
And it's a great name that when we first saw it, I think 4 years ago, we're fascinated by what do you actually do at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth?
So it's I think it's a really interesting business model and social impact model. The idea at the Center for Inclusive Growth is this. We recognize two big issues in the world. Income inequality, which you just had a conversation about, but we also recognize information inequality. And that is almost a more insidious inequality than income inequality, because if you don't have the information you need to succeed, you will never be able to get out of the situation that you're currently in. And let me give you an example. We hear a lot about AI. We hear a lot about machine learning. We hear a lot about data. Well, we know that many private sector companies and commercial companies are racing ahead, zooming ahead to understand how data, how technology, how all of these things can impact on the commercial side, the commercial customers. What we're seeing is a huge inequality gap forming between the data haves and the data have-nots. And so what we're trying to do at the Center for Inclusive Growth is really tackle two of those issues. Certainly income inequality around financial inclusion, and that's an area that we could talk a lot about, may not have time for. But the other area is this idea of building capacity in the social sector around data and analytics, so that social sector organizations and public sector organizations can benefit from evidence-based decision-making and growth, much in the same way that we're seeing on the private sector side of the house.
And Shamina, let's look at a couple of examples. Well, I mean, because it sounds fascinating, and again, it's a core connection between the business and the social impact, and that's what's so fascinating about it.
Right. It's, I'll tell you, one of your sponsors, I'm looking here, Unilever. It connects to this because we looked around and said, there are probably more companies who get it today than don't. So for example, if you're a private sector company and you're looking around at ways to have social impact, look no further than other private sector companies. So we looked to Unilever, and Unilever looked to us to say, look, we are two big companies who understand our role as social impact organizers. And what can we do when we bring the collective and complementary strength and resources of two large companies together to solve a problem? And that's what we're doing right now together in 3 countries. We've started a program in Africa where what we recognize and what you'll understand here is that the largest barrier to growth for a small business is access to credit and capital. If you're a small business in Africa, or frankly anywhere in the world, and you don't have access to collateral, you don't have a credit score, you're never going to get a loan from a bank at a reasonable interest rate. You're going to have to go to a money lender, or you're going to have to go somewhere else where you're paying very high interest rates and you get trapped in a cycle of debt. What Unilever and Mastercard came together to do was to say, look, Unilever, in Kenya, you have 40,000 companies, small businesses in your supply chain today who are selling toothpaste, who are selling toothbrushes, small products in Kenya to the consumers there. Those shop owners buy from Unilever every day. They buy up the supply chain every day. So Unilever actually has a track record of very, very small shop owners and how much they purchase, but more importantly, how much they pay back. So we worked with Unilever to say, look, what if Mastercard took that data and brought in one of our partner banks, in this case Kenya Commercial Bank, to recognize that behavior, that transaction behavior, as proxy for credit score, and to allow these small businesses to actually borrow from a regular bank at regular interest rates with regular deposit accounts and start to build their credit using their own purchasing history from Unilever. And sure enough, we've been doing it now not even for a year, and we've had an uptake of 20,000 shop owners who are now using Kenya Commercial Bank to borrow at reasonable interest rates to buy more Unilever product. And what we're hearing on average is that there's been a 20% increase in sales.
Fantastic example. And basically you're doing it bottom up instead of doing the more formal, official ways of giving you credit. You actually look at what actually happens. Another example which I thought was interesting is the whole gig worker that I think Sigal and Steve also kind of mentioned in a way, going beyond you know, being on a payroll and a completely different mindset of being a freelancer in a way. So how do you help them?
Well, I think it's another trend, right? So it's about how we're helping them, but I think it's more information for the folks in your audience, because what you heard is true. The economy has shifted. It's not shifting, it's shifted. In the United States, 1 in 3 Americans have gig work. That meaning they have more than one job. Gig work, I think, is a fancy word for gig entrepreneur. Basically, these people have volatile income. So what happens when you move from one employer to having to drive an Uber in the morning, you're selling food in the evening, you're taking care of children in the afternoon? It means your economic impact is up and down, up and down. So you have zero ability to suffer any kind of economic shock, much less grow for the future. So what we're doing right now is disconnecting the idea of benefits and wages from putting it to the individual and away from the single employer, realizing that that type of relationship is not going to exist in the same way that it has. And when you do that, you start to give the power and the independence and the economic ability to decision make to the individual, rather than to the employer, which is fine if you have one job and you have consistent income. But when you don't, the benefits and the payroll and the remittances and the digitization and all of that stuff has to live with the individual as the actor. So it's creating a whole new digital platform. Our first partnership in that regard is with an organization called care.com, which is the largest, has the largest platform of care workers around the world.
Yeah. And finally, you know, I always use my credit card to spend. I never thought about using my credit card to kind of plan my overall budget and savings and behavior financially, which is fascinating. To conclude, I think the bold vision of Mastercard is about a world without cash, right? It sort of interacts with the new regulation that goes to, well, I think will introduced as of January in Israel, of reducing substantially the amount, the amount of money that could be transacted on a cash basis. And I'm not sure that the Israeli regulators, what they had in mind is inclusive growth, but you obviously do have, or do see the connection between a world without cash and a more inclusive society. So how does it work?
Yeah, so if you look at the Nordics, for example, if you look at Canada, there's places in the world that are basically operating at very low levels of cash, and that's literally using paper money to transact. People don't think about paper money as anything other than it's a transaction mechanism. Underneath that paper money, when you have a world that's gone digital, and if you're still operating with paper money, you're left behind. And you're actually left behind in an almost dangerous way, in the sense that illicit activity is happening more and more in a world that transacts in cash. Transparency, growth, tracking, the ability to have economic mobility happens when you're able to transact out of your community. So if you're operating in a cash-based economy, you're operating in a place where you can only pay who you can see and only transact where you live. When you move into an e-commerce society, in a digital society, you start to grow and you start to move beyond your immediate community into a place that allows your growth to triple and quadruple and grow exponentially. Currently, 85% of the world's transactions are done in cash today. It's an enormous amount of operating capital that's still done in cash. As the world goes digital, you'll start to see
that the cash usage gets lower. And my sense is, like Scandinavia, you'll start to see increase in economic prosperity.
Yeah, and it might sound counterintuitive, but again, it's about trying to solve the problem strategically, looking sort of forward rather than just focus on the immediate cost that might be sort of connected to having or paying by a credit card.
Right. Well, I think that's why you're seeing such a growth even in Israel and among all startups. FinTech is the new buzzword because payments is the place to be because everything is going digital. So anybody working in the FinTech space is trying to get a piece of what this future is bringing.
Shamina, thank you very much. That was fantastic and helped us understand how we can help communities from a financial point of view. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the visit in Israel, which is very short. Thank you. We talked about